73,000 years ago, the sky went dark, the rains vanished, and an entire species nearly ceased to exist. Not from predators, not from war, from weather. But a small group of humans, clinging to the southern tip of Africa, figured out how to survive something that should have killed every last one of them. And the weapon they used wasn't fire or stone or spear. It was something so unexpected, so quietly astonishing, that when scientists finally uncovered the evidence, they had to rewrite the entire story of human survival. You've been taught that our ancient ancestors were helpless passengers on a violent, unpredictable planet, reacting to nature's chaos with primitive tools and animal instinct. But the reality is something far more unsettling. These people weren't victims of climate, they were students of it. They read it, mapped it, and in at least one critical moment, they used their understanding of a catastrophic weather cycle to do something no other species on Earth had ever done: deliberately position themselves to outlast a planetary emergency. And here's what makes this story truly mind-bending. There's a single cave on the South African coast, a cave that should have been empty during the worst climate crash in human prehistory, that was absolutely packed with human activity. Shellfish middens, engraved ochre, the earliest evidence of abstract thinking, right in the middle of what scientists call a near-extinction event. Stay with me, because when we get to that cave, everything you think you know about how modern human behavior was born is going to shift. First, let's understand the scale of what ancient humans were up against. El Niño, the climate phenomenon we casually reference today when our summer is a little too hot or California gets flooded, is in its ancient, unfiltered form a planetary force of staggering destruction. It's not a storm. It's a reorganization of the entire Pacific Ocean's thermal energy, and its ripple effects reach every corner of the globe. Droughts in Africa, floods in South America, fires across Southeast Asia, collapse of fish populations, failure of vegetation. It operates on a cycle of roughly 2 to 7 years, but in deep prehistory, it didn't arrive in polite modern increments. It arrived in brutal, multi-decade megadroughts that could parch an entire continent for a generation. For early Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans who had only just emerged in Africa somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago, El Niño wasn't a news cycle. It was an existential variable. Every few years, the landscape itself could transform from reliable to lethal. Rivers dried up, game disappeared, the plants that anchored entire ecosystems simply died. And the populations that depended on inland resources, the savannas, the great river valleys, the open grasslands, collapsed with them. Think of it this way. Imagine your entire city's food supply, water system, and infrastructure operated on a timer you couldn't see. And every 2 to 7 years, with no warning, the timer hit zero, and everything shut down for months or years at a time. Most people would move, some people would starve, but a rare few might figure out the timer. And those people would survive every single cycle while everyone else struggled to recover. That's what happened in Africa between roughly 19,500 and 70,000 years ago. And the archaeological record, thin as it is, tells a story of populations surging during wet periods and crashing almost to nothing during the megadroughts tied to intensified El Niño patterns and broader glacial climate swings. Genetic evidence backs this up with uncomfortable precision. When scientists analyzed the mitochondrial DNA of all living humans on Earth, tracing our maternal lineages back through time, they found something that should be impossible. At some point between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago, the effective breeding population of our entire species dropped to somewhere between 10,000 and perhaps as few as 1,000 individuals. 1,000 people. That is not a population. That is a school. The entire human species, the ancestors of every person alive today, was reduced to a group that could fit inside a single apartment block. This near-extinction event is called a population bottleneck, and for decades, scientists debated what caused it. Some pointed to the Toba supervolcano eruption 74,000 years ago, a catastrophic event in Sumatra that blasted enough sulfur into the atmosphere to trigger a decade-long volcanic winter. And Toba certainly didn't help, but the genetic and fossil evidence increasingly points to something longer, slower, and in many ways more terrifying than a single volcanic event. It points to climate. To an extended, multi-millennial period of drought and instability tied to the interaction of glacial cycles and El Niño-driven disruption across the African continent. Most of humanity's ancestral populations simply couldn't hold on. They were inland. They were dependent on rainfall-driven ecosystems. And when the rains stopped coming reliably, those ecosystems collapsed. But here is where the story pivots. On the southern coast of Africa, in a region now called the Cape Floristic region, one of the most biologically diverse places on the planet even today, a small group of humans made a different choice. Or perhaps they had no choice. They ended up at the edge of the world, with the ocean in front of them and a desiccated continent at their backs. And what they found there changed everything. The coast didn't behave like the interior. The Benguela Current, a cold oceanic upwelling that runs along southern Africa's Atlantic coastline, created a local climate buffer. While the interior baked and dried, the coastal zone retained a more stable, if harsh, environment. Crucially, the ocean didn't care about El Niño the way the savanna did. The shellfish kept growing, the kelp forests kept producing, the tidal zones kept yielding food with a reliability that the collapsing interior simply couldn't match. This is where the cave comes in. Pinnacle Point, a series of caves on South Africa's southern coast, contains one of the most extraordinary archaeological records ever discovered. Excavated by anthropologist Curtis Marion and his team beginning in the mid-2000s, the site revealed something that stopped the scientific community cold. At roughly 164,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years before humans were supposed to be capable of complex planned behavior, the people living in these caves were harvesting shellfish in massive quantities, using red ochre as pigment, and manufacturing tiny, carefully crafted bladed tools called microliths. These weren't opportunistic scavengers. These were sophisticated coastal specialists who had identified the ocean as a stable food system and built a culture around exploiting it. And they kept returning, through the very worst of the climate crises. While populations elsewhere were vanishing from the fossil record, Pinnacle Point shows continuous or near-continuous human habitation through periods that should have been uninhabitable. The people of Pinnacle Point weren't just surviving, they were pioneering a cognitive leap. To exploit tidal and marine resources at the level the evidence suggests, you need to understand the tides. You need to anticipate seasonal shellfish spawning cycles. You need to know where the best beds are, which species are safe, and how to read the ocean's rhythms. That is not instinct. That is learned, transmitted, accumulated knowledge, the deep structure of what we now call culture. And here is the astonishing part. When climate conditions eventually stabilized, when the rains returned and the interior bloomed again, it was the descendants of these coastal survivors who spread back across Africa. Their mitochondrial DNA, their cognitive toolkit, their capacity for abstract planning and symbolic thought became the foundation for the human populations that would eventually walk out of Africa and populate the entire planet. Every human being alive today, whether your ancestors came from Nairobi or Oslo or Seoul, carries, in the deepest layer of their genetic heritage, the legacy of people who figured out how to read a coastline when a continent was dying. The open loop I promised you. That cave, Pinnacle Point, shouldn't have been occupied during a near-extinction crisis. By every expectation, it should have been empty. What the evidence tells us is that the humans who survived weren't lucky. They were adaptive in a way that required foresight, environmental literacy, and cultural transmission across generations. They weren't hiding from El Niño. They had found its blind spot, a coastal climate refuge that the climate beast couldn't reach, and they held on, generation after generation, until the world came back to them. Your brain, right now, the part of it that stress tests the future, that runs contingency plans, that quietly calculates risk even when everything seems fine, that is the direct inheritance of people who survived a planetary emergency by thinking ahead. Every time you choose to live near water, to hedge your bets, to preserve a skill that might be useful later, you are running the same ancient algorithm that kept our species alive when it had no right to be.